On April 10, 1912, the world's largest ship departed Southampton, England. Stretching nearly 270 meters long and towering 53 meters high, the RMS Titanic was a physical marvel of early 20th century engineering, setting out on its maiden voyage. Aboard were around 2,200 people, representing a massive cross-section of society. You had some of the wealthiest industrialists and renowned actors of the era, sharing the same hull with thousands of working-class immigrants traveling to America in search of a better life. To build it cost the equivalent of $400 million today, and the interior rivaled the finest luxury accommodations on land. Passengers had access to heated swimming pools, Turkish baths, squash courts, and 4 separate restaurants draped in ornate wood paneling and stained glass. That heavy financial investment and sheer physical opulence created a powerful psychological effect. To the public, the media, and even the executives who built it, the Titanic was viewed as a floating fortress, a vessel so massive and secure it was effectively immune to the dangers of the ocean. This side profile diagram reveals the engineering logic behind that confidence. The lower main body of the ship, the hull, featured a reinforced double bottom. Above that, the lower decks were divided into 16 separate watertight compartments. Mathematical models showed the Titanic could stay afloat even if 4 of those 16 compartments completely flooded. Because engineers trusted this threshold, they viewed physical lifeboats as a redundancy. The ship carried just 20 lifeboats, only enough to hold roughly 1,200 people, leaving 1,000 passengers completely unaccounted for. But the vessel's design wasn't the only risk factor. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the company that manufactured the Titanic, was on board, and he wanted to prove his new ship was also the fastest on the Atlantic. He heavily pressured the crew to maintain a grueling speed of 21.5 knots, or about 40 kilometers per hour. Under this corporate pressure, 62-year-old Captain Edward John Smith made a series of critical omissions. Over the course of the journey, the bridge received and ignored 7 separate radio warnings about heavy ice from nearby vessels. On the very day of the crash, Smith even canceled a mandatory safety drill. The combination of a mathematically flawed safety threshold and intense corporate pressure to maintain speed ensured that as the ship sailed into the freezing Atlantic night, its passengers had virtually zero margin for error. By 11:39 p.m. on April 14th, the environmental conditions were highly dangerous. The temperature had plummeted, and with no moon in the sky, visibility across the black water was incredibly low. Up in the crow's nest, lookout Frederick Fleet peered into the freezing wind. Without binoculars, he suddenly spotted a massive, dark shape looming directly in the ship's path. He rang the warning bell 3 times and frantically telephoned the bridge. Iceberg right ahead. This top-down schematic tracks the exact moment of failure. When the alarm sounded, the immediate instruction from the deck officer was to steer left, but the steersman at the wheel, Robert Hitchens, panicked. In the confusion, he turned the wheel in the exact opposite direction, steering the Titanic to the right, angling the right side of the ship directly toward the ice. By the time Hitchens realized his mistake and attempted to correct the course, the ship's massive forward momentum made it impossible. A hazard that could have been avoided entirely became a direct threat in a matter of seconds. At exactly 11:40 p.m., the Titanic collided with a mountain of ice estimated to weigh 1.5 million tons. But it wasn't a head-on crash. Instead, the massive block of ice grazed along the right side of the ship for 10 agonizing seconds. This cross-section shows why the ship's primary defense failed. The double-bottom hull offered protection from underneath, but the sides of the ship were constructed with only a single layer of steel. The immense weight of the iceberg easily pressed into this weak point, popping the steel seams open. The water rushed in immediately. Remember the 4-compartment safety limit? The 10-second graze had torn a gash long enough to breach 6 separate watertight compartments. When the ship's architect, Thomas Andrews, inspected the damage moments later, the reality was stark. With 6 compartments filling with ocean water, basic physics dictated the bow would drag the rest of the ship under. The sinking was now a mathematical certainty. Despite the fatal damage, panic didn't set in immediately. The company's marketing had been so effective that passengers simply refused to believe the ship could sink. Because of this complacency, the very first lifeboat, designed to hold 65 people, was lowered into the water carrying just 28. But as the clock struck 1 a.m., the ocean flooded the entire front half of the vessel. The sheer weight dragged the bow deep beneath the surface, forcing the massive rear propellers to lift out of the water and into the air. The severe tilt shattered the illusion of safety, and total chaos erupted on the decks. Meanwhile, a potential rescue was agonizingly close. Another vessel, the SS Californian, was completely visible on the horizon, just 37 kilometers away. The Titanic's crew fired off distress rockets, but the Californian's captain dismissed the flashing lights, assuming the wealthy passengers were simply throwing a late-night party. A different ship, the RMS Carpathia, did pick up the frantic radio distress calls. The operator immediately diverted course to mount a rescue, pushing the ship to its absolute maximum speed. The problem was distance. The Carpathia was 107 kilometers away, a trip that would take 3.5 hours. With the Californian ignoring the visual signals and the Carpathia hours away, the 1,500 people remaining on board were entirely out of options. The final lifeboat was lowered at 2:05 a.m., leaving them stranded in the middle of the freezing ocean. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic's physical structure reached its breaking point. With the front half entirely submerged and the rear suspended high in the air, the immense mechanical stress snapped the ship into two pieces. The stern crashed back down before quickly filling with water and plunging into the depths. Hundreds of people were pulled down with the wreckage, while those who managed to stay on the surface faced an immediate secondary threat. The Atlantic water was -2 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, human survival is measured in minutes before fatal hypothermia sets in. By the time the Carpathia finally arrived an hour later, they were met largely by a sea of floating bodies. The massive death toll was not dictated by the sinking itself, but by the lack of lifeboats to keep people out of the freezing water. The global reaction to the loss of 1,500 lives was immediate. Intense official inquiries were launched in both the US and the UK to dissect the overlapping failures, from the ignored ice warnings and the steering panic to the SS Californian's refusal to assist. The disaster forced a complete rewrite of maritime law. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS, was established. It mandated continuous 24/7 radio watches on all passenger ships and strictly required a lifeboat seat for every single person on board. It took over 70 years to finally locate the wreckage in 1985, lying almost 4 kilometers beneath the surface. Today, metal-eating bacteria are rapidly breaking down the hull. Scientists estimate that by 2030, the physical remains of the Titanic will completely disintegrate. Yet the story continues to grip the public imagination. In 2012, plans were announced to build an exact replica, Titanic II, to sail the exact same route. The project remains stalled by endless delays and lack of interest, a fitting end for a ship whose original sinking proved that human vulnerability will always outweigh technological arrogance.